as soon as I started including these drivers, I, got very interested in this survey because I was like, all right, now we have a sort of a more holistic look. I think, you know, naturally there's going to be different, sort of primary concerns. And I think our opportunity with a survey like this is to find where that overlap is and sort of leverage it for improvement in the future, but to also sort of take and internalize this list of driver concerns inside of your own company, right? Like, trucking is difficult. It's an essential industry that every corner of the nation depends on, even without knowing it. To the average consumer, the supply chain is magic, and sometimes a black hole. Products on store shelves, dinner on restaurant tables, packages on doorsteps. It's expected to be there on time, every time, and only recognized if there's a service failure. But how is a sausage made? Who's talking about the issues that matter to trucking companies?
Welcome to True North Truck Thought, or the TTT Pod for short, a monthly podcast hosted by Scopelitas Transportation Consulting and brought to you by True North Companies. We're here to demystify the magic, address the black holes, and to talk trucking to the industry we love. Whether it's the latest research, upcoming laws and rules, safety issues and solutions, or practical discussions about real-life supply chain challenges, the TTT Pod is here to help the most important industry in our country to navigate its greatest challenges and opportunities. We bring together some of the best and brightest experts to talk about and tackle some of the most pressing industry issues. So without further ado, I'm Steve Kepler.
And I'm Sean Garney. Let's get trucking. The economy's stupid. It's a phrase famous to political junkies, spoken by James Carville in 1992 as a campaign strategist for Bill Clinton's successful presidential run. It was also the prevailing refrain coming from the trucking industry, according to the American Transportation Research Institute's Critical Issues in the Trucking Industry annual report, released just last week. For nearly 20 years, ATRI, the research arm of the American Trucking Associations, has been conducting the survey of industry practitioners to determine the most important issues they face. Over the years, participation has grown, and so has interest in the results. Now, ATRI releases the survey results at a highly anticipated and well-attended event at ATA's Management Conference and Exhibition, called The Big Reveal. The annual survey provides important snapshots into the challenges being faced by our industry. As this survey has evolved over the years, more stakeholders have been invited into the fold to provide their opinions. This year, the survey included responses from over 4,000 stakeholders, 47% of whom represent motor carriers, 29% were drivers, and the final 23% were from the other stakeholder category, which included both law enforcement and industry suppliers. This year, the economy has ranked as the most important issue for the first time in over 10 years. Today, we're going to discuss the issues that matter most to the trucking industry according to ATRI's survey. We'll also break down the results according to the issues drivers, including both company drivers and owner-operators, care about most, and compare and contrast those with what's on law enforcement's mind as well. With us today is one of our favorite and most frequent guests, Mr. Bert Mayo, Vice President of Risk Solutions at True North Companies. Bert has more than 20 years of experience in the trucking industry and has developed a reputation for partnering with clients to develop and implement corporate-wide strategies focused on preventing injuries and crashes. Welcome, Bert. Welcome, Steve. Excited about today's topic.
Good morning.
Morning, afternoon, wherever anyone is.
Who knows when they're going to watch this one. Well, Steve, we were at the conference. We were at the Big Reveal. It was a drama-dripping event where Rebecca Brewster sort of announced this top 10 one by one, and we heard feedback from both drivers and motor carriers, so it was really good. Perhaps to frame up the conversation, you can give us just a little flavor for what, as a whole, the industry as a whole sort of thinks are most important, including the opinions of drivers, motor carriers, and other.
Sure. Thanks, Sean, and welcome, Bert. I guess before I jump in, I would encourage everyone, if you have not had a chance to download the research, go to ATRI's website. It's a great resource, and there's lots of information in the work that they've done. So you mentioned at the start, economy was the number one issue of the industry. Um, Truck parking was number two. It rose one spot over last year as a second ranked issue. Um, Fuel prices were third, and that was a drop of two spots from last year. They've been doing this for quite some time. Um, the driver shortage was fourth, and that dropped two spots from last year. Driver compensation was the fifth item on the list, and obviously one being the most prevalent. Um, and so that's the top five. The bottom five were lawsuit, abuse reform, driver distraction, which is the first time that appeared on the list at all since 2018. Driver retention was number 8. Detention and customer facilities was number 9. And zero emission vehicles was number 10. First time that's appeared on the list. A couple other things, kind of looking back over the last 10 years they've done this work. So in the last 10 years, there were 3 items that appeared on the list every single time: driver shortage, driver retention, and truck parking. So those have been on the list every single time in the last 10 years. 2 items have been on the list 9 times. The economy, the only year, and this won't surprise you guys, the only year it was not on the list was 2021, right? Rates, everything was going gangbusters. And interestingly, the other item that was on the list 9 times, but not this year, was CSA. So CSA is not on the list in 2023. So that's a quick summary of the kind of the global issues. And again, I encourage everyone to take a look at the report and read it.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve, for providing some of that background. Gives us an overall take. Interesting that the economy is number 1 again. Also interesting that it's only not been on the list once. It's sort of a catch-all. It feels like a catch-all, though, right? Because there's lots of other things in this issues on this list, 1 through 10, that also sort of include the economy, right? So why do you think the economy is sort of number 1 some years and not others if all of these issues are sort of related in some way to economic forces? What do you guys think about that?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I'd love to get Bert's thought on this too. But I think a lot of time, particularly this year, the economy is not just on the trucking industry. It's a kitchen table issue, right? Everybody's worried about it. Inflation has been up. Interest rates are up. The freight markets are softening a little bit. Rates have gone down. So I think there's a lot of people getting squeezed. A lot of carriers that got into that. We talked about 2021 a little bit. A lot of carriers got into the business because they were chasing the money back in that year, and we're seeing that contraction in the business. So, I think all of those things are certainly impacting on that. And there's some concern. There's unease in the world going on right now, right? So I think people are concerned about not just what's happening here in the U.S., but globally, and how that's going to impact on our economy.
Yeah, Steve, I totally agree. I love the statement kitchen table issue, right? When that's on everybody's mind, it can't help but impact everything we do, right? We're all uncertain on tomorrow in a way. We've seen, you and I discussed earlier, I mean, we've seen some pretty big operations in our industry just go away here in the last week. And so when that happens, it feels close to home, right? So, yeah, looking back over the past, so when you made that comment, Sean, about it, 2021 was the only year that the economy wasn't an issue. If you look even back prior to that, in 2019 and 18, it was bottom 5. In fact, it was like 8 and 10. So I guess the statement is all ships rise with the tide, right? We've had pretty good economy. Things have been going very well. So we've put other things in the front.
So driver shortage is number 2, which is was that right? Was not number 2. It slipped 2 spots to number 4.
Flip 2
So
spots.
last year we were
Number
talking
4,
about
yeah.
80,000 drivers short, and now we're around 64,000 drivers short. What do you think has been the biggest impact? Or let me ask that a different and perhaps more interesting way. Are we getting better at driver recruitment, driver retention, or is this just a reflection of the economic cycle?
Yeah, I got to jump in and say we're not getting better. I mean, no particular, we're not indicting anyone in that statement other than, and my favorite part is when we get to the end of this and we compare that still motor carriers and drivers are just on two different pages on the issues. I think we're still, that's our concern. But yeah, I think it's purely economic. The freight's not there, so we don't need as many drivers.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think one of the things that'll be interesting to see, and it's unfortunate that the safety data lags so much on economic data, but it will be interesting to look back once the safety data comes out on this year's performance, because I would suspect that the safety numbers, and if you look at some of the early predictions, it's getting better. I would think that when the economy's tough, a lot of those kind of the ones that are on the fringes that probably shouldn't be in the business in the first place are getting out of the business for different reasons. Either they can't compete, they got in at the wrong time, they can't manage their business effectively, and that gets to culture issues, right? We've talked about culture in the past. If you and it's so easy to get into the trucking industry, right? Anybody, you got $300, essentially, you can hang a shingle up. So I think that's some of it. I think the larger question that still lingers in my mind, Sean, to your question is, there's a difference between a driver shortage and a shortage of qualified drivers, right? And that's a nuance and I think that question is still somewhat up in the air as in terms of are there qualified drivers or we have a shortage of qualified drivers too.
So not making any headway, but the numbers are going down. So I suppose we have a mixed bag. Another thing that I thought a little bit about reading this list is really how much of these rankings, so many of these rankings are similar year to year. I think there was only two really new issues on the ranking at all this year. And I'm wondering how much we think sort of the responses to these are actually the pains felt by practitioners, or if in some ways they're being driven by what's being talked about in the media, or is it just a virtuous circle, right? Are we, of course, talking about the things that matter the most to us in the media, or that sort of thing? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess just opinion, right? Is it? I believe operators, the trucking companies themselves, I think they're pretty isolated. We're all influenced by media, but I think when it comes to a survey, I think you're kind of isolated. And this is my opinion, is that we answer how things are feeling that moment in that time, right? And so, yeah, and I think the same with I know drivers for a fact in the surveys I've done in the past, they're brutally honest. So
and consistent. I mean, their responses are very consistent. Yes. Pay me more, give me less detention. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, parking. Look, and I don't mean that. I know you're probably getting to that, but parking to me being the driver's second, it's a convenience thing, right? Pay me more and give me a place to park. So I don't think it's so. If you were looking at back to the media statement, the media is telling us truck drivers are making more money than they've ever made. It's still not enough. Whatever it is, it's still not enough, right? And I think operators would just cringe at that. But I think given the fact they can earn the same money and stay at home and have more convenient lifestyles, I think.
Well, so will it ever be enough? I don't mean to just totally, move us to this next block of questioning, but what I found so interesting on the driver compensation was that it ranked 5th overall, right? Drivers were 23% of respondents. It did not even make the motor carrier top 10. Wasn't even in the top 10. So it's clearly, all of those drivers decided that was the number one issue. So on driver compensation, will it just, should we just assume it'll always be the number one issue, or do you think we could get to a time and place where there's some equilibrium there? Like we've had previous years too, where it's been a top issue for carriers and a top issue for drivers, and that's a particularly challenging pickle, because that means carriers are thinking, oh, I'm paying a lot of money for my drivers, and drivers are thinking, oh, you need to pay me more money for my drivers. But this year it wasn't even on the carrier's radar. Do you think we'll ever get there? Go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
Yeah, I think some of that has to do with last year, last 2 years. I mean, if you look at ATRI's operational cost study, driver pay has gone up substantially, and it went up over 15% between pay and benefits last year. So my sense is a lot of the carriers have said, look, we feel we've made good advancements and good progress in that space. And I think it's also a function of when the survey was done. This survey was done in August and September of this year, and we've seen rates turn, right? And so I think there's some drivers that are getting squeezed between that and fuel prices. Particularly, there are a large number of owner operators and that are part of this survey. So I think that's somewhat a function of where the market is today. But I do want to go back to your question about media real quick, because from my perspective, the thing I love about the trucking, and there's lots of things I love about trucking industry, but the one is they're practical people, right? Their margins aren't large, so they really need to think before they make decisions, right? Because they don't have the luxury of making big mistakes, right? So I think they pay attention to the media, and they certainly listen. But I think when it comes down to brass tacks and making decisions for their business, they really are very focused about, okay, how is this impacting me and why am I concerned about it? So and that's another reason why transportation is a leading indicator in our economy. I think so. It's a good question, and I think it's a broader question. We don't have to get in this conversation now, because I think that's a whole. I think a lot of other people in our country are swayed by media and by social media, in ways they probably shouldn't be. But I think the industry on the whole is very practical in where they do business.
Steve, I've always said that motor carriers pay, and I believe this. So for you drivers listening, I truly believe this. Motor carriers pay as absolute much as they can. They pay drivers absolutely the most they can pay them without going out of business. I don't think it's a function of the motor carriers' piece of the pie they're sharing. I think it goes all the way back to the freight rates that we're getting today. That's to your point. They're very practical. They want to keep their drivers. They want to keep their drivers happy. It's just sometimes it's not there.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I think
sorry, go ahead, Steve.
No, to me, that's one of the great things about this exercise is it helps. And I know, there's always a divergence between motor carriers and drivers. And I think one of the great outputs of this exercise, it helps each other learn from each. And okay, well, what can I do to make things better?
So, okay, I'm going to go that way then. New plan here. What can we do to make things better? We were talking about driver pay, driver compensation, and of course the ATRI survey comes with 3 recommendations for each of the problems, right? So they suggest what might be some alternatives, and the survey respondents, they choose the ones that they think are most effective. So let's see if I've got all 3 of them here. Yeah, the 3 impacts, or the 3 proposed strategies for dealing with driver compensation. Quantifying the impacts of compensating drivers for all hours worked. That's number 1. Analyzing driver compensation models and their relationship to driver satisfaction and productivity. And number 3, research and prioritize the effectiveness of programs that incentivize drivers for retention, safety, and performance. What I love about this, Steve, is it goes directly to your comment about the pragmatism of the trucking industry, because really, like at base, without thinking it through very, very much, the solution to a driver compensation problem is like increased compensation. But instead, what people are responding to is, okay, where shall I do that? how shall I do that? I need to make sure that my resources are, effectively stewarded and that I get the results. So I think that's super interesting. What do you guys think about those three particular solutions, and which one, might yield the more interesting or effective sort of analysis that would help carriers, reach that magic mark?
I mean, the last one, I can't remember the exact wording of it. I don't have it laying here, but I love the incentivizing for performance, whether, how you define that performance. I think that's, to me, in my experience, that's what I've seen be effective. And your best drivers make the most money. And, but there's another piece to that I want to just step back to, though. If we are paying them the most we can pay them based off of what freight we get, it back to being practical. And these guys aren't running 10, 15% profit margins. I mean, these guys are running on pretty thin profit margins. So that's how I believe, or why I believe they're paying the most. Sometimes it's just kind of a internal marketing, if you will, or an internal awareness. Hey, drivers, we're paying you all we can pay you. And here's what's included in that, right? And I think it's pretty frequent when I talk with drivers, they do not understand everything that they're paid, to include benefits and all the things that come with company pay. The same thing, but then you take the other side on the IC, which that's where the survey gets a little, when we group it all into one response. The IC he's getting the big settlement, but now he or she's got fuel, tires, maintenance, taxes, play, all of that comes out of that. That's the stuff that just erodes that. But I do think the internal marketing up to the driver, to your driver population of, hey, we're doing all we can, and here's what we're doing, and here's what it means to you. I think that's important. I see companies miss that.
So for ICs, just real quick, Steve, for ICs, their top was not compensation, but was fuel prices, which is sort of the inverse of compensation, right? It's like a huge cost center. So they know that if I can do better on fuel prices, my compensation goes up. So sorry, Steve, for hopping in there.
No, you're right to point that out, because it's a definite cost center. That's the biggest cost center, and they don't have the leverage like larger fleets do on pricing. They're subject to the volatility of the market. So I agree there. To me, I think all three of these are very useful strategies, and I think a lot of it. And if you look at the successful fleets, to Bert's point, to add, being transparent with your drivers and helping them understand what impacts on the business is important, and listening to them when they're pointing things out and actually doing something about it. Right. I think that's important, number one. And I think a big part of that if you look at kind of the evolution of the industry, what's driving that is fleets now have much more access to more data and more information, right, on all parts of their operation. Right. And so it allows them to use that in different ways, if they do it the right way, to educate their internal staff as well as their drivers, right? And have them be part of the entire fleet solution. So I think all of those things, that those strategies are, because I think we know that those things can work, and we know those things are important. So let's see if we can make a more substantive and quantitative correlation with those things. I think they're great ideas.
Steve, that's why I love you. Other than Sean and me, you're the smartest man in this conversation today.
Thank you. I don't know. Should I be thanking you for that or not?
I know I'm thanking Bert for that. Appreciate you, Bert.
I have literally been involved in thousands of driver surveys. And here's the one thing I tell the motor carrier when they engage with a survey today is you have to respond. I don't care if it's a thank you for your participation. I'd prefer it be something more. But don't do a survey, set the results on the shelf without some response, because that's meaningful, right? To your point, that's meaningful. They've told us right here what's important to them. We're going to take it in consideration. This is what we've done about it. Some response to, I think, even in an ATRI survey, everybody knows it's out there. And so just say, hey, we're going to help. We're going to work on your issues.
Bert,
I think
You're bearing the lead here. You've been involved in thousands of driver surveys. It's time now for you to provide
Absolutely.
a summary of what you feel top driver issues are.
The one, the one thing, and I can tell you what it is, and this sounds a little arrogant, and it's not. It's because I have literally surveyed thousands of drivers from convenience store fuel haulers to over the road, 3-4 weeks, irregular, you name it. We've done the surveys. The one glaring standout in all of them over and over is we do the
Yeah.
Likert scale.
Yeah.
It's
1 to
pretty,
5. I like,
this,
or don't like. Yeah.
strongly agrees. Yes. Yeah. And we'll do management or operations also, dispatch, terminal manager, whatever their particular structure is. Over and over, survey after survey, drivers will say, and the one question we ask is, my dispatcher, my manager, my day-to-day person cares more about the delivery of the load than my
Oh,
well-being.
man.
And here's what's funny is that day-to-day person, dispatcher, driver, manager says, I do, 85%, and drivers continually say they don't. It's that day-to-day communication, that day-to-day and we know this. We know the dispatchers, the driver managers do care, but it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning: is do we let them know? How do we let them know? Because there hasn't been a dispatcher I've ever met that doesn't care about his or her drivers, but it's not relayed in a real way. But that's the one of all that we look at all kinds of variables. We have 10 to 12 variables we look at, but that's the one that stands out over and over, survey after survey.
Wow. That's big. I think probably the topic of another podcast. But let's keep pressing into this because I like this conversation too. So in a perfect world, you'd see that survey and then you'd look at the driver managers and the drivers would be like, hey, what's the number one thing you want from your dispatcher? Oh, I want them to prioritize me over, operational efficiency. And then you'd like to see from, those middle managers or those dispatch folks like, oh, I want to see my driver succeed. What are you hearing from management on this topic? When you survey management, how are their views different? What is the most important thing they care about?
So, yeah. So, I think I'm answering it. They will. So we'll ask about the company, right? We'll ask the same question of the company to the drivers. Does your company care more about you or the delivery of the load? Drivers overwhelmingly say, yes, the company does care about me. And the management, actually, what's interesting is leadership, senior leadership is more realistic. They're more in line with the drivers. They're lower than the day-to-day. The day-to-day person is where I see the divergent, right? Is leadership will say, and I'll make up a number here without looking at, they'll say, yeah, 75% we care. Drivers will say 70% they care. But when you get to the day-to-day person, it splits drastically. They go 85-90, 50-60.
Well, that's an interesting observation because if you look at the respondents to this ATRI survey between the drivers and the motor carriers, they only share three things amongst both of them, right? So truck parking, fuel prices, and the economy. The others are divergent from that. And that's not atypical. Every year there tends to be some different. And maybe Sean, I'll flip it to you. What are your thoughts there about, what does that tell us about the state of the industry? And is the fact that they are different, is that a bad thing, good thing? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, this is something as soon as I started including these drivers, I got very interested in this survey because I was like, all right, now we have a sort of a more holistic look. I think, naturally there's going to be different, sort of primary concerns. And I think our opportunity with a survey like this is to find where that overlap is and sort of leverage it for improvement in the future, but to also sort of take and internalize this list of driver concerns inside of your own company, right? Like to Bert's point, how does middle management really show that they care about the driver? Well, they could speak in these terms, they could speak to these items. But that middle manager, boy, he's got so many pressures on him from an operational standpoint, or her, from all these perspectives, and that person can't always be the driver's friend, probably. Whereas upper management can say, well, this is our governing philosophy, and I'm going to tell my operational managers to like go forth and conquer, and be kind to drivers. And they're like, well, but I've got freight to deliver, and it's a little bit more challenging that way. But I do find the divergence like very, very interesting. Here's an interesting one: detention time, number 5 on driver list, not even on carrier lists, right? And on a driver, like detention time, it stops the money, you know?
Yep.
And for a carrier, they've maybe managed for that. They can handle, losing whatever it is, a load a week to detention or whatever. But a driver who gets detained, that becomes a very, very serious concern for them, So go ahead.
Let me ask both of y'all a quick question. Sean, I don't mean to kind of take over the question here, but why did that pop up? I'm looking at the overall results. That popped up as an issue in 19, and it just kind of disappeared from a motor carrier's perspective. I remember there was a time when we were, going to all the big shippers, receivers, and saying, hey, you're going to pay for our trucks sitting still. And that seems to have gone away. Drivers are still worried about it, but how has it become a bigger issue in the industry? Do y'all know?
No.
I just wonder why it did go away. What happened to it?
No, it's a good question. I mean, it's been on the list the last couple of years, but it has been kind of slowly going down the list in priority. And it's certainly a good question. ATRI is doing some research on it. FMCSA is doing some research on it. I think some of it is when you have the freight markets are starting to soften a little bit, and so and where capacity and demand, where there's a mismatch, that can impact on that detention time, right? If you don't have the right matches, if you will, and drivers are being held out, that certainly can impact on the prevalence of detention for sure. But I think a lot of carriers are getting smarter about that, not just from a more leverage with their shippers, but also how they're managing their drivers and their asset allocation, right? So they're getting better at matching the freight with the needs of the shippers and the customers. And you're seeing a lot more drivers at home more often, generally, than they have been in the past. So I think there's kind of a more sophistication being introduced into the market on many of the fleets is probably contributing to some of that.
Well, and go ahead.
And we don't. I guess I was going to ask. We don't think it went away. I mean,
No.
I
Not at
work
all.
heavily in the intermodal space, and I can tell you the ports and the rails, it's still struggle there. So I just wondering
So
what's
one
been the
interesting data point is it looks like, I'm looking at the list now, and driver detention peaked or made its debut on the list in 2019. I'm not sure how that correlates with the surveying of drivers, like when that started. But the thing that peaked at number 2 that year was hours of service. Well, so what changes the next year?
The rules changed.
Right. Things got a little bit more
flexibility.
flexible. And all of a sudden, 2020, it's 9. 2021, it's 7. 2022, it's 6. And now it's off the list. Probably off the list because of a little bit softer of a market.
But interestingly, on that point, and who knows, we'll see if it comes back around. But on the driver list this year, the ELD mandate popped up.
Yes.
It hasn't been there for a while.
Yes. And why are we talking about the
Yes.
ELD mandate?
Well,
whatever, 5 years hence.
Well, I think a big part of it is there's more enforcement going on. I think that's a big part of it. And we've been talking to a lot of carriers are getting more and more violations cited, and in some cases for things that may or may not be directly impacted to safety. They're more administrative in nature versus actual hours violations. So I think there could be some of that creeping back in.
I think that's a frustration for sure. Do you think that the ELD mandate, like that popping on a driver's list, is just a proxy? Like, I'm blaming the ELD for challenges I have in my own management of my time, like as far as hours of service, right? Am I blaming, said another way, am I blaming ELDs for my lack of hours to drive, right? That I can't exceed the hours as easy anymore, and so I blame the ELD. I think a big part of it is yours. We've experienced that. Drivers are getting frustrated. FMCSA started counting against carriers' violations for ELDs being unable to transfer, and that's certainly a challenge. ELDs have been getting pulled off of the marketplace or off of the registration list through FMCSA enforcement action. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but do you think one of the reasons could be that I want to drive more hours and my ELD won't let me? You just say yes.
It certainly could be a possibility, but I would think that it's related to detention, right? And so there's our correlations. So potential.
Well, and Steve, I'd ask you, being the third smartest man on the call. That's a joke. You're number 2.
Wait a second. Hold on.
I don't know if you're.
I need to know the full rank.
Maybe we should survey our listeners.
That's right. Comment, please. Comment.
No, that is not happening. But the CVSA, your CVSA background. So I guess I was asking kind of the same question. Is enforcement now finally fully mature, right? Because if you look on our law enforcement survey at first time ever, which was great to see, that's number 2 for them, is hours of service. And I would have told you we've kind of solved or cracked the code, right? We've solved our ELD, hours of service to be us all one thing. But drivers are saying no. To your point, Sean, I think it's not allowing me to do what I want to do. I haven't figured it out. It's whatever it is. It's intrusive. And then law enforcement saying, listen, guys, you need to tighten up on ELD, on your hours of service, because it's not working.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I do think there's a push and pull here, right? The ELDs don't allow, while the rules got more flexible, the ELDs don't provide any flexibility. It's pretty black and white, right? And so I think from the enforcement perspective, what I'm seeing, what Sean and I are seeing, there's, I wouldn't necessarily call it mature. I don't think it ever will be mature. But I think there's a lot of progress being made in the states of being more focused on ELDs, not just roadside, but as part of investigations and audits as well. So there's a lot more activity going on kind of behind the scenes that are trying to, look at where those problems are occurring. And I think that there is a lack of flexibility that for sure that the devices just don't provide that. It's pretty black and white.
Interesting. So there's, a lot of things pushing ELDs to the top or near the top of driver lists, one of which being enforcement, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Enforcement priority.
I think if you look at it too, drivers, on a global level, because the other thing on the driver list that showed up that's not on the carrier list is speed limiters.
I was just going there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and I think it's part of my other sense is it's part of the overall conscience right now in the industry that, look, the market's tough. We don't need more regulation, right? We don't need more stuff. It's already tough enough to operate, give us some flexibility to run our business. So I think there's some of that's kind of manifesting itself, my view, in some of these responses.
Yeah, I'd agree with that 100%. I mean, I think that overall sentiment in the industry is prevalent. You can look at the number one issue, the economy, and the number one recommendation for that issue, which was to relieve overly burdensome regulations or relieve the industry of those overly burdened regulations. it focused, the write-up focused mostly on environmental rules, but it's clear that folks feel constrained, and that breaking out of that could be helpful. What's interesting too about speed limiters being on, detention time being on driver's list, and neither one of those making the carrier list, is sort of an interesting thing too, because carriers are like, well, we have speed limiters, we can turn them on, we can manage to that, like we can plan for that. And drivers saying, well, if you limit my speed and you hold me at the shipper, I'm going to drop a load a week. And that's real money, So just such a existential problem for drivers, really, So good. Well, should we move to talk a little bit about sort of law enforcement? We did that already, but the law enforcement's top three issues were distraction, hours of service, and I think the last one was driver training. Is that right?
Sean, I got to jump in. I know I'm
please
hijacking your
do.
statement, but man, driver distraction being on the top of the list from the men and women that are charged with protecting the motoring public. And it's not even truck drivers. Come on, guys. Motor carriers, they make it winds up on their list, but I can tell you that you drive down any interstate anywhere at night, I see guys holding their phone in their hand. I mean, that's what I like about the law enforcement being involved this year. It's still an issue, and I don't know how drivers don't see that.
Well, I think it's a good point, Bert. If you look at a number of, first of all, that a lot of the industry think, and rightly so, it's the four-wheelers that are the problem, right?
Yes.
And so I'm not saying we don't have a problem ourselves, because we do, because it's showing up in the data. But I think if you look at survey after survey of the general public, they don't feel they do anything wrong. They feel it's everybody else that's the problem, right? And so I think part of it, in my mind, to your point, why I think the law enforcement view is important to think about, is it's more pure. That's what they see every day, right? So we have to acknowledge, okay, is this real or not? If so, what are we going to do about it? And that's an interesting perspective that they bring to this. And so they feel it is. Maybe we don't, but clearly they feel it is. So what are we going to do about it, right? And so
we look at, and I'm sure y'all do too, with your customers. I look at, and I'm not picking on drivers. I was a driver. I'm a big driver advocate, but I see today on any motor carrier I look at today, I'm going to pull month over month, there's going to be one or two handheld device issues. I mean, motor carriers with any size, it still has, and I don't know what we do about it. I mean, I have an opinion, zero tolerance, but, or, better awareness. Was it Minnesota that did the 6 seconds? I mean, very compelling video. I'm sure y'all have seen it. Yes. Impressive video. If you haven't seen it, please go see it. But I guess I'm surprised that commercial drivers, even for their own kind of taking care of their own, if you will, right? Because I cannot go down 20 or 75 or 85 out of Atlanta through Atlanta and not see truck drivers on their phone at night. It's still a common thing.
It is. It's a problem.
Think
You're right.
That there's been some atrophy on the issue, right? Like it popped into it sort of jumped into the forefront in, I don't know, 2007, 2008, when we started figuring out about cell phones, right? And it was very popular. And then there's just been a lot of messages about it over the years. And, some folks may think, well, I'm going to do the best I can, or I know that's what they say, but maybe this doesn't apply to me. Or has it just been such a looming message that it's lost its value? Clearly, and I say that because the people that are watching, that are looking for this type of thing, and most of us aren't, besides the number one smartest guy in the room, Bert, and law enforcement. Law enforcement is confirming that it's still a problem, but other folks don't necessarily think it's a problem anymore. So what do we do? And again, a topic for another podcast, but what do we do to convince people it's a problem again? You know, we got to break out of our echo chamber for one.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
It's that's what people are saying, what they're doing are two different things, right? That's the big part of the problem. And the other thing, to be honest, it's difficult to enforce. It's difficult to enforce, that cell phone requirement because the officers, have to see it in action, and so I think it really, to me, the message is we need to rethink our strategies, and to see how we can double down to make that issue even more front and center. And it's got to involve more direct, in my view, and that more direct engagement with the tech providers and the OEMs, because they're the ones that are engaging directly with the drivers, and so it's going to be uncomfortable conversations,
Yeah, I think about that, Steve, and certainly, I guess we built 12 more podcasts out of this one, but um, I think about that from a lobbyist perspective, right? They have literally no holds barred on how they market their product and sell their product to who they sell it to. I mean, it's anybody can get it and anybody can use it anytime they want. It's you're right. It's going to be very uncomfortable, but I believe. I mean, if the data is true, and I believe what we hear, that's all I can see. It's still an issue, and it still causes deaths on the highway.
It does it, and the other thing is, it's not just the cell phone issue. There's other things, and you can't regulate stupid, right?
That's right.
And lots of people are stupid out there. They're reading books while they're driving.
Wait a second, Steve.
They're doing.
I think 390.5 requires us to take stupid out, right? Doesn't it say you've got to be knowledgeable in the rules that apply to you, right? So we have regulated stupid, haven't we? We tried.
Actually, that's an interesting point. I think, again, another topic for another conversation. But again, it gets. Fundamentally, we all need to be more responsible on the road, and I think one of the things we've seen with, not to get on a soapbox, but we've seen with COVID, people's behaviors since COVID on driving have changed. People are taking more risks. They're not being smart about how they're managing themselves on the roadway. All of us, and frankly, it's showing up in the numbers. People are dying on the roads, and we need to be better about it.
And Steve, it is your point about it's no longer, they're not talking on the phone anymore. You're right. They're on a social media platform. They're liking, they're watching, they're doing everything but talking.
Yep.
Talking, I think, was okay. And I shouldn't say that out loud, right? It's the other things they're doing with that device is the issue.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the good news was I read this morning that preliminary numbers for Q1 of 22, fatals down 14%. So good news for us. Yeah. So I think as we're rounding the bend here, covered most of the waterfront. I, as usual, want to give everybody an opportunity to provide their final thoughts, and I want to maybe pose one question to you. And we talked about a bunch of lists: the overall list, the driver list, the motor carrier list, the law enforcement list of top priorities. What do you fellas think is missing from either one of those lists? What do you think? What do you wish had been in there or had bubbled to number one, or what have you? And I'll give you a second to think, because I know I did not put this on our pre-question list. But I think as this conversation developed, the one thing that I thought of when we started talking about law enforcement and driver distraction is the issue I wish was number one for law enforcement was enforcing the rules for people driving around and near trucks, right? I wish their number one issue was helping the rest of the motoring public understand how a truck operates and what it means to drive safely around them. So I'm going to toss that one out as my missing piece. Steve, Bert, you guys got some missing pieces you could share for us? Maybe we'll plant a seed and we'll water it, and next year around this time we'll see it on our list.
Well, Steve, I'm going to let you pontificate, and I'm going to go second, and I'm going to amen, Sean. Absolutely, Sean. I hadn't thought about, but yes, that would be incredible. That's been a lifelong thing. I've seen not even just taught right at driver's ed or young drivers today, just being taught how to drive around a truck. But I'm gonna go the safe way, but it's not the safe way. It's just culture, man. I mean, I'd love to have seen them something about, and maybe it's in all the responses. Maybe it is the answer I was looking for. Is this industry worth? Do you want to be here? Do you like being here? And I go back to a recruiting ATA recruiting thing in Nashville years ago. This individual, I can't remember who he or she was, sat up in the front of the room and said, "How many of you were ex-truck drivers?" You know, we were all a bunch of recruiters and safety professionals, and like 90% of us raised our hand. And then he said, "How many of you are actively pushing your kids into the industry?" And none of us raised our hand. And that's, I would like to see some question, or, you know, there's a lot of things going on right now. Driver wellness, driver mental wellness. Is this a place they want to be? We've got to perpetuate this industry. And I just, again, maybe it's wrapped up in all these questions, but I'd like to see a very poignant
That's another podcast, Bert. So add that to the list. Like, Steve's been thinking about this, and we've been talking about it quite a bit. Like, how do we manage those disparate messages that our drivers are getting about the essentiality of the industry versus the safety challenges of the industry versus, like, hey, should you do a job that could, you know, that one accident could put you in jail? You know, like, all of those messages are really challenging for the industry and for the drivers. But go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think mine, and it's been on the list in the past, but not for quite some years, is the cumulative impacts of regulation. I think, and if you, and just a couple of recent examples, and also the lack of, you know, it's people are quick to want to implement new regulations, but when's the last time one's been pulled out of the book?
Right? 2 years
There's some
ago.
that have been in there on the book. Well, okay. All right. Smart guy.
Certification violation.
He just got it.
That's the reason I'm bottom of the list. But I think, you know, look at two examples we have right in front of us right now. So we've got the zero emission vehicle stuff that's going on with EPA and CARB. It's got the industry out of their minds, rightly so. And the AEB rule, NHTSA's cost benefit analysis was out of whack, right? So if you're going to implement regulations, let's make sure we got our sound reason for doing it, and we can articulate the costs and the benefits and why we're doing it, right? So, and let's constantly evaluate what's already on the books and pull stuff off that doesn't need to be there anymore. To me, if you look at kind of, those are real costs that are imposed on the industry, and enforcement too, because enforcement has to enforce those rules, right? And if you ask enforcement, I bet you they'll tell you a bunch of the stuff they don't even pay attention to. They know what impacts safety, right? So to me, that's a major issue that I wish would have been on there. And it's kind of embodied in a couple of the other ones that are on here. But to me, that's a large effort that collectively as an industry and as safety professionals, we need to take a harder look at.
I don't disagree with that. You know, having been an advocate, you know, when the previous administration was asking for rules to be removed, you know, and lots of people had lots of great ideas, and I myself put together a pretty long list of things, and almost none of those got done, you know. And so it's a super challenging scenario with this sort of regulatory lock-in that we have, and how difficult it is to remove things. And what's the thing we did get removed? The certification of violations, which was a pro forma activity, you know, that people weren't really paying attention to anyway. So I'm with you, Steve. I was, of course, poking fun, but I hear you, brother, for sure. So awesome. Well, thanks again to Bert and Steve. Of course, really appreciate your contributions to this podcast. Yeah, and with that, I think I'll pass.
Sean, I want to I'm going to leave it with you because you were the one that said it, but, you know, we talked about a lot, and I just want to remind everybody, motor carriers especially, talk to your drivers about this, right? I mean, that's to me, that's the takeaway from this is read the survey or at least the high points and talk to your drivers about how you're trying to help them, because we're all
yeah, that's absolutely, you're absolutely
No
right,
doubt.
Bert. And all of this research, and this one's no exception, but take it, digest it, create an action plan, socialize it, and to your point on this one in particular, like, how do we get these list of issues to converge so that we can work together to create one solution? And part of that is making sure you're talking to your drivers. Let's not be surprised when their list comes out and you're like, oh, I didn't even think of that. That's a good point, Bert.
Yep. I did rank it, Steve, and you jumped to the top there after Sean's sarcastic remarks.
Yes.
Oh, man. Oh, well, with that, new smartest guy, Steve, why don't you take us home?
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Bert. Always a good discussion. Thanks for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the Triple T Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@truenorthcompanies.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a safe day.